so that people can get their hands on that. That is on my to buy list as well. So
Thanks.
fantastic. Now, I did say that when we were going to speak to you that we would have a look at characters and character development, because your characters, there's so much to them. You certainly can't be accused of being two-dimensional at all. So let's talk about your characters. Do you have a favorite character to start with that you've created, not anyone else's?
Well, a lot of my characters, I suppose the protagonists in the main series are all characters I'm fascinated by. Harry Devlin in the first series, the Liverpool lawyer, who is a likable guy, doesn't have much luck in his private life, but he's very dogged and persistent. I like Harry, still do. I'd like to write about him again one day. So Harry was very definitely not a self-portrait, but he was my idea of a Scouse detective, a lawyer, an amateur detective, somebody whose doggedness and persistence gets him through to solve mysteries, beginning with mystery in his private life when his estranged wife, Liz, is murdered. That's in the first book, All Lonely People. And so writing about Harry was hugely enjoyable. That was my first breakthrough as a novelist after all those years. And,
oh, you would be fond of him then, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. I owe Harry a great deal. And those books were fun to write. And of course, the more you write, the more confident you become, not just in terms of the storylines, but also developing the characters. And in those books, originally, everything was seen from Harry's point of view, sort of third person point of view, but limited viewpoint, if you like. Looking at it through Harry's point of view, and gradually as the series developed, I began to broaden that out a bit. And when I was asked to write a series with the rural setting by my editor, I decided to set it in the Lake District, which I felt was a terrific place to write about and also to visit to research as well. That came into it. And I decided that rather than having a single character, I would have two. And I began with a male character, a historian called Daniel Kind, who leaves Oxford and goes to find refuge in the Lake District after some traumas in his personal life. And the idea was that there would be a slowly developing relationship with a woman, a female detective, a professional detective, a police detective chief inspector called Hannah Scarlett. And so I wrote that first book, The Coffin Trail, introducing Daniel and Hannah. And Hannah really only comes into it about halfway through. And when I'd finished the book, I showed it to a friend of mine, Peter Robinson, a very, very fine writer indeed, creator of DCI Banks. And he said to me something I've never forgotten. He said, Hannah is really going to be your key character. And as he forecast, that has turned out to be the case. Although I began with Daniel, Hannah has grown and grown in significance, and she's now the dominant force in the series. I recently finished book 8 in that series. So that book, The Crooked Shore, comes out in June or July. And the relationship continues to develop, although at a rather glacial pace, I should add, because I like writing about them and putting obstacles in their way, that sort of thing. So really that series is an example of doing something different, writing about a developing relationship, which is embryonic at the start of the series and then slowly develops over the course of the series. And actually, that's one of the attractions of a series. You can move people forward over the years and see what happens to them, see what happens to the relationship. So I've enjoyed doing that. And with Rachel, Rachel, the book Gallows Court that you mentioned, that came about in a very different way. By that point, I'm going back now about 5 years, The Golden Age of Murder had been published, the non-fiction book about the detection club in the 1930s. And to my astonishment and everybody else's, it did really, really well. I thought it was a very niche project, put it mildly, but it was actually a bit of a breakthrough. It's quite transformational, as it turned out, very, very fortunately. And I'd read and continue to read an awful lot of these books set in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, as well as contemporary fiction. And so it seemed natural to try my hand at writing a book set in that particular period. And that was an idea that appealed to me. But I wanted to do something quite different. And what I didn't want to do was to write just a pastiche, cozy whodunit. Many people have done that, and it's been done so effectively that there seemed to be no point just writing one more book of that kind. I thought I'd try to do something a bit different. And what I did was I actually began with a character. I began with the idea of Rachel, who is a young woman in her 20s. She's fabulously wealthy. She arrives in London, having had an upbringing on an island in the north of England, just off the Cumberland coast. And she arrives in a small entourage of three servants, and she becomes involved in a sequence of bizarre murder mysteries. And a young journalist called Jacob Flint becomes fascinated by her and intrigued, and he wants to figure out in some way what her story is, what her agenda is, what drives Rachel on. And that was the starting point. That was the premise. I didn't know much more than that, but that idea really seized my imagination. So it was a different way of approaching a character from the Liverpool books or the Lake District books. It was quite different. I didn't have a publisher or a contract. And again, it's this issue of writing what you believe in rather than what you're commissioned to write. And I thought it would be a gamble to write a book in a different way without knowing how it is going to unfold, and to write it in a different period, all that kind of thing. But I decided to indulge my instincts, really, and see what happened with it. And so with that starting point, I began to write. And after much trial and error and much writing and rewriting and endless revision, Gallows Court was the result. And my agent sent it round to leading publishers, and it was wonderful because I actually got, really by far the best contract I'd ever had at that point, and it was very exciting, and it was also a very big relief, I can tell you, after all that work, to think that other people were interested in something that, again, had seemed a slightly quirky idea, because it's quite a dark book, not cozy at all. It's also a bit of a thriller rather than a conventional detective story. So it's quite different from my other books, and I think quite different from books generally. So it was an experiment, but the more I delved into the character of Rachel and Jacob, who became increasingly important as I wrote the novel, the more I enjoyed discovering about them.
You're absolutely right that it is, or it certainly feels, completely different in terms of a crime novel, and it does feel really dark. And I'm every time I turn a page, I wonder what's going to happen next, which is fantastic because that's what you want your reader to feel.
Yeah.
I don't feel as though any of these characters are safe,
Yeah.
which feels so unusual in a book.
Yes.
So can I just say, if anyone is thinking about reading it, it is really, really good. And I can't put it down now. I must admit, I'm more than half the way through, and I really can't put it down. It did take me a little bit to get used to it because it is so different, but it's well worth having a go at. Sorry, a bit of a fan now.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
So you'd obviously decided that you were going to make it darker. So
Yeah.
how do you then develop the characters from there? Do you really, it feels as though they've got a huge backstory that you've not let us into.
Yes. And that's an idea I have about series characters that I've had for quite a long time. Partly influenced by the number of series that I've read over the years, as well as the books that I've written. And it seems to me that if you have in mind at the outset that you might write quite a bit about a particular character, you need to think about that character in quite a lot of detail. But I also think that you don't want to put every piece of the jigsaw puzzle together straight away, because if you do that, then you may just find yourself in due course and years to come going over old ground too much. Whereas I think a bit of discovery is a good thing. And I first experimented with this kind of approach with the Lake District books. And there's something in the first book, The Coffin Trail, something is briefly mentioned almost in passing that doesn't play a particularly significant part in the story, certainly isn't relevant to the solution of the mystery in that book. But I had in mind that there would be something that would be the subject of a novel at a later date. And I also introduced a kind of subplot in that book that was developed and resolved in the second book, The Cipher Garden. But the idea that I planted in the first book, I've only just resolved about 15 years later in the book that's coming out in summer. And it's been there in the background. It's referenced once or twice, just in passing, but again, pretty obliquely so that people wouldn't notice it. But I like to think that it now makes sense of some aspects of character that haven't been fully revealed in the earlier books. Now, that to me is a very, very attractive way of writing because it keeps you fresh, it keeps you interested and excited as a writer, this idea of constant exploration. I think that there are drawbacks because I think my kind of writing sometimes requires a reader to invest quite a bit of patience and goodwill in the story, see how it will all unfold. I think that that's for sure. That if you're writing characters in depth and you want to build up a convoluted and interesting mystery as well, you have to lay the groundwork for it. So you hope that your readers will bear with you and not become frustrated by these things happening that they don't really understand. And so the challenge is to try to keep faith with them and to keep them hooked as you gradually develop what is really driving the story on, and it all becomes clear. And in the second book, set in the 1930s, that is in the same style as one of my editors describes it. Golden Age Gothic is the way she described it. It's got quite a good term, I think. And that is very much a detective story, but it's a very labyrinthine detective story. And my idea for that book was that the reader knows that there's a complicated mystery going on, but the precise nature of the puzzle that the reader is being asked to solve isn't immediately apparent. You think one thing's going on, but there's also something else going on in the background. And that is an idea that appeals to me greatly. That book, Mortmain Hall, was a great joy to write. But again, it's in some ways a slightly challenging book to read, I think, because there's a lot of stuff happening, a lot of characters popping up, but how do they all fit together? Do they fit together? So there are cons as well as pros to this particular type of writing, but it's certainly a style that very much attracts me. I think it's quite unusual, but it's also interesting for me as a writer to explore the potential of the storyline and of the characters, and to some extent to the setting as well. So settings vary from book to book. So the whole combination of things is very appealing and very motivating. And that I think is what you want as a writer. If you've written 20 novels, as I have over the years, and 60 or 70 short stories, I think it's very, very important to maintain your energy levels and your enthusiasm, your excitement about writing. You don't want it to become a formula. I've done this a million times before, so I'll do the same thing, but it's just slightly different. I think that doesn't enormously appeal to me. I think each book I'm trying to make a little bit different from the last book and the previous book, so that there's always something to intrigue me in what I'm writing. And again, there are drawbacks, because sometimes you get halfway through and you're not really sure if this is going to work. But again, by keeping going and by rewriting extensively where required, as fresh ideas come to you. And of course, if you're writing a novel over a period of months or more, then you've got time for fresh ideas to come to you. And sometimes those fresh ideas will make sense of something you weren't quite sure about when you first wrote about it. So it can have a very, very benign effect on the writing process, I think.
So going back to developing these characters and the huge backgrounds that you obviously have developed for them, do you sit down before you actually sit down to write your book? Do you sit down and flesh out your character? Do you write your character and their background first?
Well, if I go back to the very first Harry Devlin book, I was an inexperienced writer at that point, and I was very committed, but also nervous. And so I planned quite extensively. I planned that book pretty fully with chapter outlines and character biographies and things like that. Over the years, I've planned less. The Lake District books are written in a slightly different style, as well as having a very different setting, different characters. And they have a more relaxed type of writing style than the Liverpool books, which were an attempt, in my mind, to combine a gritty, modern, urban setting, Liverpool, in the 1990s, with classic Golden Age style plots. That was the concept of that first series. Frustratingly for me, Golden Age plots were so out of fashion in those days that none of the reviewers ever mentioned the plots. It's all about the gritty Liverpool side of things, and Harry and Sam. There you go. I think things are a bit different now. With the Lake District books, I didn't plan the characters so much. I thought quite a bit about Hannah and Daniel, but I had a slightly more relaxed approach to writing. By that point, I'd written 8, 9 books before, so I had more experience and therefore more confidence. And what I have with those books is I will always know how it ends. I will know who kills whom and why. And the why will always be very significant, and it will be something that really interests me, the motivation, the criminal motivation. So the challenge might be, why would nice person A actually murder nice person B? It may be something like that. So motive is part of the key, but how you get there and how the characters develop, I don't plan as much. With Rachel in Gallows Court, I did realise that I was taking a real punt with that idea, and I was a bit nervous about it. And what I decided to do was to write a short story about Rachel.
Ah.
That's what I did. I've never sent it anywhere. I've never shown it to people. I've never submitted it for publication. But I wrote this short story with a view to seeing whether I liked writing about Rachel, because I knew that that was the key. If I was sufficiently interested in and engaged in writing about Rachel, then I'd be able to sustain myself over however long it took to write this unusual story, which I didn't know how it was going to work out at all. And so I was happy with the short story. So that gave me the encouragement to press on with the novel. But there were moments of despair, I must say, along the way. That's for sure.
It's funny that you've said that you wrote a short story about her, because actually I can see that. Now you say that, I can see that's what's happened, because there is so much detail, but just slightly hinted at in her background. So yes, that makes perfect sense. That's a really interesting idea, actually, writing short stories about characters to develop them, but then never go anywhere.
Yes, it's the only time I've ever done it, but I was very pleased with the result, because, as I say, I wasn't writing the short story for its own sake, for publication. I was writing it as an exercise to get myself focused on the nature of this person I was going to share a lot of time with. So that did that in that particular case, that did work really well from my point of view. I was glad I did it.
Well, I'm wondering now whether we're ever going to see that short story. Is it going to appear at the back of one of the novels?
Well, I'm not sure, because the Rachel of the books does develop in a different way from the Rachel in that short story. So there's one element of that short story that features in Mortmain Hall, but it's a subsidiary element. So I don't know. I think probably not. I have written one short story since then about Jacob, in which Rachel doesn't appear. So Jacob investigates in one short story, which I hope will be published before too long. And that again was an interesting idea from my point of view, of taking this character, the young journalist, and having him as a kind of amateur detective. That was the idea, and it felt right. Yes, that's a short story I'm quite optimistic about.
Right, fantastic. So, is there going to be a short story about the Trumans as well? I feel that there needs to be.
Well, there may be. The Trumans are developing in my mind. I've just been writing about Martha
Yes.
today, and Martha's a character who interests me enormously. I think Martha's got a lot of potential, and the Trumans in the book that I'm writing at the moment, the third book, the Trumans do feature more extensively than in the earlier books.
Yeah.
Because there is, as you suggest, there is more to be said about them.
Yes. Right. That is, I think, the beauty of these books, that there is so much about these that appear to be smaller characters, that there's so much background to those, that I'm sort of thinking, oh, I wonder what happened there. So yes.
Terrific, yeah. Well, of course, that is the reaction one dreams of as a writer, and tries to achieve. And I think that if you're a writer, if you're writing books that are a bit out of the ordinary and your readers stick with you, then you want to give them some reward in the sense of the development and the excitement of interesting things happening to justify that investment of time in getting used to this.